Okay, so we talked earlier about some of the conditions that Mexican American workers were facing during World War One. Now let's take a closer look at the participation of Mexican Americans in World War One. So first off, when World War One started, there was a law that all Mexican Americans, whether they were migrants or whether they were U.S. citizens, had to sign up for the Selective Service Program, right? They had to sign up for the Army. Now, this wasn't actually a draft yet. It's just where you have to sign up for selective services in case there was a draft. But this law is going to cause some Mexican Americans, thousands of them, to actually leave the United States during World War One because they were afraid that that law meant that they were going to be drafted. Okay, eventually there would be a draft, but not yet, right? So Mexican Americans would prematurely leave the United States because they didn't want to be drafted for this war effort during World War One. But on the other hand, many Mexican Americans actually did fight for the U.S. government during World War One, and many of these Mexican Americans were segregated into separate groups led by Anglo-American officers, and they experienced a lot of discrimination while in the Army during this time. And you might think, well, why did Mexican Americans want to even join the Army in the first place if they're going to be, discriminated against? Well, they did it because they wanted to show that they were loyal to the United States and hopefully gain better conditions in the U.S. after the war, right? After they returned from the war. But still, many Mexican Americans experienced discrimination during this time. Now, after World War I, the United States would experience an economic recession, right? So things aren't going good in the economy. And this is the time when Americans will turn on Mexican workers because they feel that they're taking their jobs. And so there would be a big push to deport Mexican migrants, and this is going to be the repatriations, and basically just means deportations, where Mexican migrants would be deported back to Mexico because of this economic recession, as well as because what was going on with the Red Scare. We'll talk a little bit more about the Red Scare a little later. And so many Mexicans would be deported, even some Mexican Americans during this time, to Mexico because of this economic recession, right? So during the war, they needed their labor. After war, the economy starts to go down, and because of that, they don't need as much Mexican labor, and so that's why you see these deportations taking place after World War I. All right, now let's go to California during the same time period and see what conditions were like for Mexican Americans there. And so in Los Angeles, where you have a large Mexican American population and Mexican population, you're going to see that there's a lot of segregation going on, and where Mexican Americans live is not the best area, but still they have very high rents. Their living conditions are not very healthy at all. You're going to see very high infant mortality rates because of the conditions that they're living in, and education for Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Los Angeles are also very substandard during this time. They don't receive an equal education. There's segregation in the school system, and the education that they're receiving is extremely subpar. In terms of workers, you'll have Mexicans and Mexican Americans working in various different industries in California. One industry would be the agricultural industry, working as farm workers, where pretty much the majority of farm workers, 3/4 of all the farm workers in California, are either Mexican or Mexican American. And so you'll start to see farm workers begin to organize during this time period, but there's a lot of weaknesses in their organization, right? The unions that they create to fight for various rights. What are some of those weaknesses? Well, for example, a lot of these unions that are created early on among the farm workers in California are going to be temporary unions. They'll form for a period of time just to fight for certain rights, and when those rights are received, then those unions break apart. Another problem with these early unions amongst farm workers in California is that migrant workers are always on the move. All right, they're either living in the city, or they'll travel for a period of time to work in the fields, and then they go back to the city, and so it's hard to constantly stay together and keep the union together in solidarity because migrant workers are always traveling for their jobs and where they live. Okay. Another problem for these early unions is that the growers, or the farm owners, are going to violently repress these strikes by these temporary unions. Okay, so they'll get involved. Local officials will usually side with the farm farm owners or the growers, and so you'll see them working to stop the strikes of these early unions, right? So definitely a lot of oppression going on and economic obstacles in California during this time for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. You're also going to see more Mexican Americans migrating to the Midwest during this time, right? Why to the Midwest? Because there's a lot of job opportunities there. There's the railroads that you'll see Mexican Americans making up a huge part of the workforce on the railroads. Steel mills, right? In the steel industry, the automotive industry during this time is going to hire a lot of Mexican and Mexican American workers, as well as meat packing plants. So all of these job opportunities are going to lead to the establishment of Mexican American communities in the Midwest. In places like Kansas, you're going to see Mexican communities receiving a lot of discrimination. They're going to be banned from public facilities and schools, pretty much segregation going on there in Kansas. And so in order to fight back against this discrimination, a lot of Mexican and Mexican Americans are going to have to organize their funds in mutual aid societies, such as the Benito Juarez Mutual Aid Society. And so they will organize their funds and develop their own institutions, like their schools and, like a baseball league and their church organizations and church events. They're going to have to form all that themselves because they're being segregated from the larger community. All right. In Chicago, you're going to see, like I said, Mexican Americans moving there, working in like the meat packing industry. And in Chicago, the Mexican communities will usually be experiencing pretty poor living conditions. They often live in neighborhoods that are broken down. They'll be living in overcrowded situations, right? So a lot of people living in, like a small home or renting a home or an apartment and trying to fit as many people in there as possible because they don't make enough money. Even though their wages are a little bit better in the Midwest because of these jobs are usually a little bit better jobs, like, meat packing jobs, factory based jobs, they still have struggles in paying their rent. And so they're living in these overcrowded conditions, in broken down neighborhoods, in a very unhealthy environment. Sometimes they're living close to where they work, like the meat packing plants, where, if you're living around a bunch of dead meat, it's going to smell pretty awful. And so people are living near those industries. It's horrible smelling conditions. If you're living near one of the steel mills, there might be toxic fumes coming out into your neighborhood. And so this is the conditions that Mexican Americans will be living in Chicago. All right. And so more job opportunities, but still you're seeing discrimination, segregation, and poor living conditions as Mexican Americans start to migrate to the Midwest.